Carolina Government and Heritage Library. We are part of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Please visit our website to learn more about the library's collections and services. You'll find a link to our website in the chat. And today I'm also joined by a couple of my colleagues here at the library, Molly Goldston, Rebecca Hyman, and Francesca Evans. They will be moderating the chat and troubleshooting any issues that hopefully we will not have today. You probably also saw in the chat that today we are able to offer closed captioning for this webinar. To view the captioning for this program, please take a minute to locate your meeting control toolbar. You'll see it either on the top or bottom of your screen, and you can click the closed captioning button, and you'll be able to select either show subtitle or view full transcript options, depending on whichever you prefer. If you have any questions or issues during the presentation about the captioning, please text us in Zoom chat and one of our staff will message you to help you with that problem. Next, we ask everyone to please keep their sound on mute during the presentation, and which will last until about 11:35. We have a formal part of the presentation that will last until then. And at that point, we will open it up for questions. And I'm sure that many of you may have some from this very, very exciting topic. Excuse me. And at that point, you can either put your questions in chat as they occur to you, or feel free to raise your hand. You'll find the raised hand feature under the reactions menu option. It looks like a smiley face with a little plus sign over its head. Thank you. And I apologize for a scratchy throat this morning. It's still allergy season in here in North Carolina. And at the end of the presentation, please take a moment to complete a very short survey for us. That'll help us know what you liked and didn't like about the presentation, and to do more in the future for you. And finally, we'll be sending you an email following the event. It will include a short survey if you missed it, the list of resources that have already been shared in the chat, as well as a link to the recording of today's webinar, which will be posted on the library's YouTube channel. So I know that's a lot of information, and we'll get started now. So again, for everyone who's just been joining us in the last couple of minutes, thank you all so much for joining us this morning, and welcome to our webinar, More Than Just Bed Covers, Uncovering the Lives of North Carolina Women Through Quilts. We are extremely excited to be able to share this special part of North Carolina history with you today. Many of us have grown up with quilts that have been handed down through generations in our families, or perhaps you bought one at a craft show or a fair, or perhaps others have stayed somewhere where they had the good fortune to curl up under someone's heirloom quilt. But what do we really know of the hands who crafted these beautiful and functional pieces, or of the lives of women who pieced cloth and lives together? We wonder, what stories do quilts hold, and how do we unlock those stories to get the quilts to share those stories with us? And what do the fabrics themselves tell us about history, the economy, the lives of women and their families? So today, I hope we will all walk away with a little more insight into why quilts are in fact more than just bed covers. So I'm delighted to introduce our guest, Diana Bell-Kite. Diana is Curator of Cultural History at the North Carolina Museum of History in Raleigh, North Carolina. Diana holds a Master of Arts in American History from the College of William and Mary, as well as a Bachelor of Arts from Davidson College in Davidson, North Carolina. At the museum, she has curated or co-curated numerous exhibitions, including Everyday Artistry, which was a 2008 exhibition spotlighting Tar Heel quilting. She has also curated the story of North Carolina history, known to many of us who have visited the museum as its 20,000 square foot anchor exhibition that tells the chronological history of our state. In 2016, she curated another textile exhibition that shared the extraordinary life and work of Raleigh formal wear designer Willie Kay. And finally, more recently, in 2019, she curated Quilt Speak, uncovering women's voices through quilts. Diana is first going to share with us an overview of the history of quilting in North Carolina, along with a number of her favorite examples. We'll follow that with a brief conversation to learn more about the North Carolina Museum of History's quilt collection, what methods curators and historians use to find the meaning stitched into quilts, and how the role and meaning of quilting in women's lives has changed over time. So with that, I will give a very warm welcome to Diana and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kelly, for that lovely introduction. I'm very happy to be with you all today. And as Kelly said, over the next few minutes, I'd like to give a brief overview of the history of quilting in North Carolina. And many of the points that I'll cover hold true regionally or nationally, but I'm not trying to make any global or sweeping assessments. Just give a summary of what you find in North Carolina. And this information is taken both from my work at the North Carolina Museum of History, as well as a variety of sources of information that you will find on the resource list that Kelly and her colleagues provided in the chat. Notably, I'll mention the research of the North Carolina Quilt Project and their publication, North Carolina Quilts from the mid-1980s, which was a really groundbreaking study of quilting in the state. After our brief overview, I will talk about 3 specific quilts from our collection in more depth and go into a little more detail about their makers' stories. And finally, for the bulk of our time, as Kelly mentioned, she and I will have a conversation and field your questions. So hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint here, and I'll go ahead and get started. Okay. So I'm just going to give sort of a chronological overview of quilting in North Carolina. And the earliest extant quilts from North Carolina hail from the 18th century through the antebellum period. The tradition of quilting was brought here from the British Isles. And typically during this period, quilting was the realm of wealthy women, using expensive imported fabrics and making showpieces as a way to demonstrate their needlework education in their ample free time. And trends that you'll come across during this period are whole cloth quilting, where the top of the quilt is all one fabric and the only pattern is made by the stitching in the quilt. Also stuffed work, which is a very laborious process, sometimes called trapunto, where raised designs are made on a quilt by inserting batting or fill into pre-stitched channels and designs to give a 3-dimensional effect to the bed cover. And stuffed work was often combined with other techniques that you'll see in quilting. And applique quilting, which where patterns are made by stitching fabric shapes to a ground fabric. And probably the most significant trend during this period that you find in North Carolina quilts is chintz applique. And this is an example that you see here of a chintz applique quilt. Chintz was a polished cotton fabric printed with colorful designs. It was imported typically from Britain, where manufacturers had figured out how to mass produce Indian dyeing methods and export them. Chintz was expensive, and quilt makers, remember at this point, we're talking typically about well-to-do white women, often with significant participation by the women they enslaved, would cut out the patterns from this fabric, whether that be birds or flowers or baskets, and then rearrange them into new patterns, often on a neutral ground fabric. And in the South and in North Carolina, these types of quilts often had a center medallion format surrounded by multiple borders. And this example that I've shown here is an 1836 quilt made by Elizabeth Carnegie of Duplin or Jones County. And you see the central chintz motif, in this case, a tree of life, which was a very common motif for these quilts. And it's surrounded by rows of flowery appliques and finally 2 uncut chintz borders. And it's important to note also, I mentioned the involvement of enslaved women in making many of these quilts, that enslaved women also made quilts for their own families. But there are very, very few extant examples of those anywhere. And unfortunately, we don't have any in the North Carolina Museum of History collection. All right, if we move forward in time, around the Civil War era, we start seeing more utilitarian quilting in the in the material culture record. And North Carolina's textile industry started growing in the 1830s with Edwin Holt's Alamance Mills, which was producing the first dyed and patterned fabric in the South and manufactured in the South. And this industry would really take off after the war with locally produced low to mid-grade woven cotton fabric. And also you start seeing these iconic plaids that came to be known as Alamance plaids that were strongly associated with the North Carolina Piedmont. And you're also still seeing in this period a lot of fanciful applique, not so much chintz applique after the 1840s as it starts to go out of style, but you start to see more red and green applique, very skillful work, often repeating pattern applique. And you also start seeing more pieced quilting. Piecing is when you join fabric pieces side to side rather than one on top of another, like applique. And it uses less fabric than applique and was sometimes chosen as a technique by quilters who prioritized saving fabric. This quilt you see here is associated with Edith Uzzell of Wayne County, and it very well may feature some of the Alamance plaids that I mentioned, which often included blues and browns like you see in this quilt. Right. In the late 19th century, you really start to see the growth in affordable fabrics mass produced in the region. You also see the widespread use of chemical dyes that allow for vibrant colors to be produced cheaply. Many of these weren't color fast over time, though, so you'll often see in late 19th century quilts, you'd see olives or grays where you'd expect to see greens or purples because those colors have changed over time because of fugitive dyes. Quilting as a craft of necessity, quilting as a craft was really democratizing during this period. People whose mothers and grandmothers who had probably relied on woven coverlets or blankets rather than cutting up expensive fabric to make quilts could now purchase fabric more cheaply for making clothing and for quilting. However, you still have women, as in the past, showing off their needlework skills and access to expensive fabrics through quilting, rather than using quilting as a way to keep their families warm. And this is best exemplified by the late 19th century trend of crazy quilting. Crazy quilts are very distinctive in appearance if you've seen one before. They usually feature luxury fabrics like silk satins and velvets, and they're arranged in asymmetrical pieces joined together with fanciful embroidery, as well as sometimes painting on fabric, beadwork, any number of different types of embellishments you'll see on crazy quilts. And the motifs used often reference Asian-inspired designs like pagodas and fans. This crazy quilt you see on this slide was made by Anna Armstrong in 1894 in Pender County as a gift to her son, Thomas. And there are several origin stories. Historians have different perspectives on the origin of crazy quilting. Some scholars say that it came out of an Asian arts exhibition at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876. In any case, the trend lasted from about 1880 to 1900, with some usually more modest examples of crazy quilting being seen up into the 1920s. The Great Depression era is a period that for many of us has informed our collective sense of, quote, old-timey quilting. Hearing stories from our mothers and grandmothers about thrift and saving feed sack fabrics and sewing scraps has really sort of made the 1930s quilting boom part of our collective memory. And the 1930s were a real heyday for utilitarian quilting. People got creative with reusing fabrics like feed sacks, which manufacturers began printing in colorful prints by this period because they knew that women were reusing them in sewing. You also see quilts made of advertising premiums, military surplus fabric, any number of reuses. This quilt here was made by Katie Bowden of Wake County from sewing scraps and feed sacks. And as you can see from the photo of the backing fabric of this quilt, it's made of several feed sacks sewn together. Katie Bowden tried to dye the fabric blue, possibly to cover up the print of the feed sacks, but you can still see it pretty clearly. Following World War II, quilting saw a decline nationwide, with many people leaving rural life for towns and cities, and with new synthetic materials available for home interiors. Of course, many women continued quilting as they had in the 30s and 40s and prior, whether as out of necessity or for artistic enjoyment, or simply to use up fabric they didn't want to waste. By the 1970s and leading up to the National Bicentennial, people started looking back to earlier times with increased appreciation for the handcraft of their forebears. And this increased interest led to what has been termed the Great Quilt Revival, with growing quilting activity, birth of quilting guilds, increased focus on quilting as an art form. During this period, you see the birth of the American Quilt Study Group and other organizations that emphasize quilting as a serious field worthy of academic study. This quilt was made by Beatrice Gladys Baker, a Zebulon quilting teacher, and her students to celebrate the bicentennial. And they did a historical assessment of Wake County landmarks and made an applique quilt to showcase them. And this was displayed during the bicentennial. Nowadays in North Carolina, most quilters are not sewing out of necessity or as a means of warmth for their families. Rather, they are exploring the styles and techniques that most interest them artistically. Some are making quilts as modern art with, creations of all sizes, not just the size to cover a bed, wall hangings, all different sizes and shapes. Others are interested in traditional patterns and hand quilting. There are around 100 quilt guilds in North Carolina offering every imaginable focus. And this piece I'm showing is a wall hanging made by quilter Karen Miller, and this is her interpretation of a 19th century sunburst quilt, certainly with her own twist on the final product there. So now that I've given a very brief overview of quilting in North Carolina, I wanted to touch in a little more depth on 3 pieces from the museum's collection that appeared in the Quilt Speak exhibit that Kelly mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and to illustrate the types of messages that quilts can send and the different motivations that makers at different points in time have expressed through their quilting. This quilt was made by Louisa Green Furches. She came from a prominent slave-owning family in Davie County, and her quilt was likely made as a display of skill and power. She made this Wigs to Feet, or Tennessee Beauty, as her family called the pattern, quilt for her 1852 wedding to Orel Etchison. Now, she wasn't using any old sewing scraps for this quilt. Her family sent a man that they enslaved named Dave to Fayetteville, over 100 miles from her Davie County home, via the Old Plank Road, to shop for yard goods. And she called the fabric used in the quilt oil calico, which was said never to fade. Louisa was a perfectionist by nature, and I sort of get that sense from her photograph that you can see in the bottom corner. And one relative later remembered her as, quote, a lady with a definite personality. She kept this quilt in the quilting frame for 3 months, working on it for hours a day, stitching at 11 stitches per inch. And over time, this took its toll on her hands. And she later recounted to her daughter that during the quilting process, her fingers began to, quote, fester. Given that she was facing these challenges, her mother and her sister, Sarah, pitched in to help. However, Sarah's stitches were clearly not up to snuff for Louisa, because each night Louisa would go behind Sarah and pick her stitches out. Louisa Furches was not quilting as a craft of necessity. She was doing so to show her skill and her status. She could afford pricey fabric needed to make this showstopper, and she had the hours to devote to fine needlework rather than having to spend her time doing farm work. Let's move forward in time for another story. Okay, this is Eliza Helen Rogers Arrington of Wake County, who made this strip quilt in the 1930s or early 1940s as a craft of necessity. Arrington grew up on her family's cotton farm near Cary in the early 20th century, and her parents were proud to own their own land in an era when many families, especially African-American families like Eliza's, had to work on other people's land as sharecroppers or tenant farmers. Arrington's family bought little from the store because, as her daughter later remembered, quote, they raised or made most of the things they needed. Arrington recounted that her parents, quote, almost worked them, even children, to death on the farm, but that the profit and lesson learned outweighed the labor. At age 16, Eliza married Arch Arrington, and soon after she learned to quilt from her mother-in-law. She made two different types of quilts, everyday quilts like this one, and special occasion quilts, which were used only when company came over. She believed in wasting nothing, so she used all of her sewing scraps and feed sack material. And Eliza Arrington took great pride in her quilting. And her daughter later recalled, quote, coming home from school to see my mother sitting by the tin heater, sewing by hand a quilt of her own design draped across her lap, the beauty of her smile and satisfaction expressed on her face for having completed another quilt is a lasting memory. While she sewed, Arrington would give her daughters advice like, quote, when you grow up, be something, go to school, get an education, work and save some money. If you only make 10 cents, save 5. After a new quilt was completed, her daughters played a game where they pointed out recognizable pieces of fabric left over from making the family's clothing, saying, that's my dress, that's your dress, that's mama's dress, that's the pig's sack. The final quilt I want to share was made by Lee Jacobs, and she was a lifelong quilter, and she made this piece in order to commemorate a milestone. Another intention that you see so often in quilts is commemorative quilting. Lee Jacobs was a member of the Waccamaw tribe from Columbus County, and she learned to quilt from her grandmother, who would give her small bits of fabric to play with. And she credited her grandmother with developing her style, saying, the littler the piece, the prettier the quilt. She quilted out of necessity, making warm bed covers for her children and grandchildren, and it was a source of pride for her that she made several quilts for each child and grandchild. She had 7 children and 9 grandchildren. She also loved teaching the youth in her tribe to quilt so that the tradition would be passed down to the next generation. She quilted for raffles and powwows and tribal charities to support her community. And she made this quilt as a wedding gift to her daughter, Vonnie, who married in 1967. And she inscribed the quilt's purpose and the date on the back so that it would be associated with the event that it was intended to commemorate. And before I turn it back over to Kelly, who's prepared some questions for further discussion, I wanted to mention that all of these stories and some 40 others are detailed in the Quilt Speak catalog that went along with the exhibit that we mentioned earlier. And it's available both from the Museum of History shop, or you can check it out from the State Library because they now have it in their collection. So I'll turn it over to Kelly.
Great. Thank you, Diana. That was absolutely fantastic. And thank you for providing so much context for how quilting has changed over time, the various techniques, the materials, and also who quilted and what quilting says about the lives of women who have done it, and especially for sharing that example from Elizabeth Jacobs. That is just such a beautiful example of the role, I guess, as you've said, of memory in quilting and memorializing life's events. And thanks for sharing the Quilt Speak exhibit and the book. When the exhibit was mounted, the museum produced a catalog, and Diana has shared that here. It is actually available from the North Carolina Museum of History. It is a fantastic book that gives an overview really of the process of deconstructing, or I guess constructing, the stories of women and their lives through the quilts. And so that's a great segue, I think, to ask some questions really related to museum collecting and how the museum's collection has changed over time. Because I know it is a big collection and it's a fairly old collection, as you have said. And I wondered if you could talk for a few minutes about both the origins of the museum's collections, how various time periods and philosophies have affected the collection and what's available, and then kind of what that says about the scholarship and the methods that you have used really to try to piece together these stories and the other documents that you've used to do that, as you've done this work. So long question, but thank you.
Sure, yeah. Thinking about museum collecting, a friend of mine has a t-shirt that says museums are not neutral. And I think that's a key point to remember. Museums are institutions built by people, people with differing motivations and intentions. Our museum was formally established in 1902. Our founder, Fred Olds, had been collecting for a few decades prior in the late 19th century. And similar to most museums in that period, especially to Southern museums in the United States in that period, the focus of the collecting was very much on elite political figures, well-to-do prominent families. This is during the same period where the cult of the lost cause was really gaining a lot of traction. So a real focus on Confederate history. And so those were sort of the factors that propelled early collecting in the museum. Women's history was not a big part of that. Social history overall was not a big part of that. And this is true across the board. The first quilt that came in our collection in 1926. It was a very elaborate chintz applique quilt made by a Confederate general's grandmother. So you see the association with the prominent family. They're collecting quilts, really the majority of our collection, our quilt collection, which holds about 400 pieces now, started coming in post 1965. And that makes sense given that emphasis on growing emphasis on women's history, the new social history, the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement during the 1960s and 70s, and shifting focus across society and in museums specifically. So you start seeing a lot more emphasis on women's history during that period. So that's sort of how our quilt collection has evolved, and our collection more broadly. We have a collection of about 150,000 artifacts. Quilts are just a small part of that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. And, just as sort of an extension of that, when you were putting together the Quilt Speak exhibit, and, and as you've done more work with quilts in the collection, and even for your talk today, in terms of the other documents, the other types of, whether it's photographs, or I know you touched on, just some oral history recollections and things like that, and how you have used those kind of documents to really, pull out these stories, I guess.
Right.
Thank you.
Any sort of material culture research, I would say, requires a multi-pronged approach. Looking at the artifacts themselves, obviously, close looking at the artifacts, looking at the stitches, looking at the fabrics used, looking at the way they were constructed, and then having a broad understanding, which, looking at our collection, we're fortunate to have such a large collection of quilts to sort of contextualize new pieces, and also looking at other museums' collections, looking at the Quilt Index, which is a great resource online where you can see, thousands of quilts from all over the country, and getting a sense of, what makes this quilt typical, what makes this quilt unique, by looking at, sort of its quilt peers in a way. So that's always a big part of any kind of material culture research, but also looking at the documentary record, seeing what you can find out about the names associated with any quilts through public documents, through census records, through death certificates, and also through the oral tradition, which is, very important and hasn't always been valued in the historical profession, the museum profession, as much as it could have been. So looking at all of those angles, and what does the family who donated this quilt say about it, or what names have been associated with it? What does the pattern look like compared to other patterns from a particular region or a particular county of the state even?
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's always wonderful to be able to understand, how historians sort of piece these stories and the record of scholarship, how they piece that together to really interpret for us. And so another thing that I think you touched on in your slides is the role of economic change and how that influenced what women had available to them, and then who actually started quilting, and the change from quilting really as an elitist endeavor to the democratization of quilting. And I personally find that a very fascinating transition, especially in North Carolina, that had economic booms, and we had these regional industrial development, and as you mentioned, the Alamance fabrics. So I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit more for folks about how the role of economic change in quilting, the development of these creative economies, and and in particular, like the creative repurposing of materials that and the way in which that I know continues today in fiber work and fiber art, and to talk about that, because I know there are some fascinating examples, like the reuse of funeral bouquet ribbons, and as well as little premium silks that were put in tobacco packets, and how that and how marketing to women and men at the same time kind of changed what women had available. So
right. Yeah, people are certainly not separate from the society, the economy in which they live. And that's highly visible in quilting, where you see women primarily very creatively making use of what they have available and what's around them. And you see that, like you mentioned, with the growth of North Carolina's textile industry, which really took off after the Civil War, and with more affordable fabric available to more people. And you start seeing people using that type of, those more affordable fabrics in making quilts. And also the adaptive reuse. It always surprises me, when I see, a new type of adaptive reuse. For example, we have a quilt that was in this exhibit, Quilt Speak, where a woman from Pender County, she was very near where the new Camp Lejeune was being constructed during World War II. And she was able to get a hold of Marine Corps camouflage fabric, informally called frog skin fabric, because it's kind of greens and browns sort of spotted fabric. And she used that fabric as the backing of her quilt. So, what was going on around here very much was reflected in the quilt she made. Also with, as you mentioned, with the tobacco premiums, there were collectible tobacco flannels that were available buying cigarettes. This was in the 19 teens primarily in this region, but you would see sort of like baseball cards are collectible if you buy more chewing gum. These swatches of flannel were available to people buying cigarettes, and they had different series of pictures on them, such as Indian rugs or flags of the world, and you would collect the whole series. And so one use of them was to make quilts. And so we have a couple of quilts in our collection that are made of these tobacco flannel premiums. Another example, as you pointed out, and one of my favorite examples, is funeral ribbons, which is a very specifically Southern tradition from about the end of World War II to the early 1970s. And it was a type of memorial quilting where, when a loved one died, and people showed their respect by sending floral arrangements to the service, and those would be put on the grave. Women, sometimes a widow or a sister of the deceased, would collect the bows from those arrangements following the funeral and press them and sew them into a quilt. And the size of that quilt would attest to the number of arrangements sent to the funeral and sort of represent the outpouring of grief that a family received during that time. So a very fascinating regional traditions. So you see a lot of really interesting materials in quilting, and that's one of the more fascinating parts of studying quilts to me.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, I love the example of the frog skin backing from the material from Camp Lejeune, and that to me is just wonderful creative repurposing, and how the artist embellished to make it her own.
Right.
Thank you. That is just, I mean, what a wonderful overview, just to give us an idea of the depth and breadth of this topic. It is 11:36, and we really wanted to have some time for questions. I hope that you have them, and feel free to put them in the chat, or just raise your hand and we'll get to your questions. I can keep asking Diana questions all day, but I'm sure that you have some as well. So feel free to take a moment and put them in the chat. Yeah, Diana, we have one person in the chat that actually said that she found a funeral ribbon quilt that her great-grandmother had made while she was cleaning out her grandmother's house.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah. I would love to see a photo of that if you're willing to share.
Yeah.
I think we have a slide with our contact information. Could we put that up?
We do.
Okay.
Francesca, could you share that slide? We will in a moment.
Okay, yeah, funeral ribbon quilts are really one of my favorite areas of study, so I'd love to see examples of those.
And I just lost the chat. Okay, so I see that we have another question. So someone says, Jacqueline says, I am not a native of North Carolina, but can you please talk a bit more about the history of the Alamance fabric?
I would recommend that you check out the research of Suzanne McDowell and Lynn Gorges. They have been doing a multi-year study of Alamance plaids in particular. And their research, I believe, is available through Uncoverings, the Journal of the American Quilt Study Group, because they could speak to that in much more knowledgeably than me. But the Alamance mills, started by Edwin Holt, was, the first dyed woven cotton manufacturing operation in the South, and plaids were one of their key products both before and after the Civil War. And the blues and browns were among the more iconic colorways of the fabrics they produced, and those were very prevalent in work shirts. And it was a very sturdy sort of utilitarian product that was widespread in this region. And I would also check out the Alamance Historical Society, because they have, I believe, in their collection some extant samples of plaids produced in those mills.
Great, thank you.
And I think there's also an NCpedia article, Kelly, about Alamance mills, if I'm not mistaken.
I was actually, you beat me to it. I was just going to share.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and thank you for that reminder. So one of the projects of the State Library of North Carolina is the online encyclopedia of North Carolina. It's called NCpedia. And there are a number of articles related to quilts and textile history in North Carolina in that resource. We have included a few of those in the resource list for you today, but I do invite you to go to ncpedia.org and explore and search and learn more about the textile and quilting history of North Carolina. And we do have a multi-part history of quilting that Diana actually contributed several years ago to the resource. And there are more images from the museum's collection in that in there as well. So please visit that. And we do have some more questions for you. So Krista asks, what is your favorite historical time period for quilting? If you had to pick.
It's hard to pick. I like a good story, and those can be from any time period. Probably post-Civil War to World War II time period, just because you see so much change and so many new fabrics, and like you mentioned, the adaptive reuse of materials a lot during that period. So that's probably, I see a lot of surprises looking at quilts from that period, and that's always fun.
Great, thank you. And I see we have more, actually, lots of questions coming in. So Kim asks, speaking of photos, we talked about photos. Do you have any way, or do you know of a way for current North Carolina quilters to submit photos and info on their quilts? Is there something like that is the museum, currently collecting information about contemporary quilts?
The best way to do that would be to reach out to the Quilt Index. They're a national project centered in Michigan. And a significant percentage of the museum's quilts are cataloged through the Quilt Index. We're trying to get even more of them done, but museums all over the country, individual quilters all over the country catalog their quilts. And so that's really the biggest database. And I would recommend, taking your quilting there. You would get the widest exposure that way. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. And actually the resource list that we've shared with you has a link to the Quilt Index in there as well. So you can find that easily. Okay, so we have a question from Carol. And Carol says, how do you think the value or appreciation of hand-sewn quilts versus machine quilts may compare historically as we move forward?
I don't know if you're talking about financial value. That's not really something I go into. In terms of historical value, I think, looking at what the trends are of today is, you see so much machine quilting, and that's an area like contemporary collecting is part of our mission. However, we have not done a lot of contemporary quilt collecting, and I would like to do more. We have a pretty good overview through the 1980s, I'd say, but there's a lot of quilt history that has occurred since 1985, for example. So contemporary collecting is exciting. It's also a little hard to know, 50 years from now, looking back, will we have captured what the key trends were during this period, or will we have collected outliers to those key trends? So, that's true of contemporary collecting across the board, not just quilts. But yeah, that's definitely an area where we could focus more of our collecting because of so much amazing quilting going on, machine quilting, long arm quilting, modern quilting. We acquired our first modern quilt this past year. I was really excited about that because it's, something new to our collection that really represents an important trend of recent decades.
Well, we look forward to seeing that. Thank you. So another question from Brenda is actually apropos of that, of the contemporary collecting. Does the museum regularly display its quilts? Does it have any on display currently?
I think we have maybe 1 or 2 on display in our largest exhibit, the Story of North Carolina, that rotate. One problem or challenge to displaying textiles, as many of you know, is that they're fragile and can't be out for long periods of time. So all of the textiles in our exhibits, we have to rotate very regularly. We did have, Quilt Speak was probably our first quilt exhibit in about 10 years, or major quilt exhibit. I'd like to see more quilt exhibits. Anybody who also would like to see more quilt exhibits, feel free to make your voices heard, because we do want to hear from the public about what they want. So when you visit the museum, fill out a comment card, feel free to call one of us. We're happy to share what we hear from the public.
Thank you. Let's see. So another question, got lots of questions. I knew we'd have questions. From Terry. So Terry asks, why do you think Southern quilters, especially those from North Carolina, continue to make chintz center medallion quilts 50, I guess it says 15 to 25 years after Northern quilters had moved on, I guess, from using that technique? Do you have any sense for that?
Well, I think you see that in a lot of areas. Sort of, North Carolina during the antebellum period was not, there were not a lot of urban areas. It was like the old saying, the veil of humility between two mountains of conceit. It was not sort of at the cutting edge of many things, even, among the wealthier classes. So traditions stuck around longer here, not just in quilting, but in many, many ways. North Carolina was called the Rip Van Winkle state for many years during this period because of the slow growth of infrastructure. And so all of these things are related, and you see many traditions being held onto longer in this area, especially in rural areas, than you might see in Baltimore or in the Northeast.
Okay, thank you. Now we have actually a comment from Michelle who says, is sharing with everyone, check out the Textile Heritage Museum in Glencoe, North Carolina.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
I should have mentioned that. Yes, thank you, Michelle.
Oh, please talk about it.
Oh, I don't have any more to say other than I've heard that, I've not personally been, but I've heard from many people who have, that it was an amazing experience and they learned a lot. So definitely check that out.
Thank you. So we had another question that someone had asked earlier in the chat, and I think that staff had answered it, but the question has come back. So we wondered if you could talk a little bit about the museum's catalog, which is available on the website. It is searchable. If you could talk about, what folks might find there, how they could use it, what to know when they're using it, I guess. Yeah, and we'll share the link.
Thank you. Yeah, if you go to our the Museum of History website and go to collections, it'll have an option to search the collections. And I say take your patience with you because sometimes it can be a slow process. But anything that we have photographed in the collection, you'll see the photographs, you'll see the historical information associated with it. You'll also be able to search through that database many of our state historic sites as well. So some things will come up that start with an S number instead of an H number, and that means that they're at our state historic sites. So you'll see it's all we're all one agency, and so we share our collections in that way.
Thank you. Thank you. That is a resource that I have used in research many, many times. And we did have a comment from Susie who has left, and she wanted to say thank you for a wonderful presentation. We are so lucky to have our museum, and we echo that.
Yes, thank you.
So yeah, so before we I know we're getting close on time. We've got about 12 minutes left. Please continue to add your questions if you have any more in the last few minutes. And while we're looking for that, I was just kind of wanted to talk a little bit more with you about this role of memory. And I know that that Elizabeth Jacobs' quilt, that she created to commemorate her literacy, is really an amazing example of using quilt for memory. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about that, and how you've observed that, other examples of that, I guess, or quilt memorializing events.
Okay.
And so forth.
I think the quilt you're referring to is not one that I covered in the PowerPoint, but it's one that's in the book. It was made by a woman named Patience White, who was no worries. He was from Alamance County, and it's a log cabin quilt. I wish I had a picture to throw up, but I don't at the moment. But it is a quilt she made around 1907, and she was born into slavery in about 1830. If the documentary record about her from the census and so forth is correct, then she was illiterate, like many formerly enslaved people, since it was illegal for enslaved people to learn to read and write after emancipation. And the story handed down with this quilt was that she made it as a gift of appreciation for the woman who taught her to read and write. And she would have been around 75, 77 years old around the time she made this quilt. So if all of that information is correct, then she learned to read and write well into her 70s. And it was such an important milestone for her that she marked that accomplishment by making a quilt as a gift to her teacher. So that's one of my favorites in our collection because it's a memory quilt. She's commemorating, something very important to her, but also speaks so poignantly to one woman's determination never to give up on her goal of becoming literate. Some other memory quilts I can mention that are among my favorites. The oldest quilt in our collection is from 1781, and it is a silk whole cloth quilt made for a baby's christening. So it's a very small bed cover. It's beautiful. And it was actually made in Virginia, but the baby for whom it was made moved to North Carolina as a young man, fought in the War of 1812 here, and made his career in life here and passed down in his family ever since. Another favorite memory quilt was made, and if you look at the cover of the catalog, this quilt appears on the cover, but it is made by a woman from the mountains of North Carolina named Emily Maxwell. She was a deeply religious woman. She made quilts throughout her life. She was very thrifty. She had very strong beliefs about, alcohol was very bad. She came to believe that smoking, tobacco use was very bad. She came to believe that caffeine was very bad for you as well. So she changed from drinking coffee every morning to only drinking hot water. Sort of, a person with very strong beliefs and opinions. And late in life, in her 80s, she had a vision from God, wherein God showed her what heaven looked like and told her to make a quilt depicting what heaven looks like. And so she did. And let me see if I can share. Oh, I just saw it go by. Let me see if I can share again. Here we go. Can everyone see that?
I see you.
Oh, you see me. Okay, let me try again. Share screen. If we go to the last one here. Okay, so the quilt on the cover of this catalog is her Heavenly Vision quilt. She had a big H and V in the bottom left-hand corner of the quilt that stood for Heavenly Vision. And she told everyone in her family, this will be the last quilt I ever make. And it was. She died about 5 years later. But she was very proud of this quilt, and she hung it on her wall and showed it to anyone who came to visit. There's a picture with the quote, the preacher's wife coming to visit with them sitting in front of the quilt. So a neat story.
Thank you. No, that is, I think I personally, and I'm sure everyone enjoys hearing those real life stories that are behind, these just lovely works. So we do have another question actually about the relationship to quilting to clothing actually. And so, Kathleen asks, does your museum have any examples of 18th century quilts or quilted petticoats, which were sometimes repurposed from quilts or used as quilts?
We don't. That would be lovely. I know Colonial Williamsburg has a great collection, and Linda Baumgarten there, who's recently retired from there, has written about that extensively. The crib quilt I mentioned I don't know of any relation between that and a quilted petticoat, but just the sort of the use of silk, the time period, the whole cloth quilting is sort of reminiscent of the type of quilted petticoats you also see during that period. That's maybe the closest thing we have to that sort of relationship, but I would definitely check out Colonial Williamsburg's collections and also Linda Baumgarten's past publications. She does some amazing work in CAD where she's able to outline the designs of the quilting in a computer program and then show it separately so you can see it much more clearly than you can just looking at the quilt.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. We are getting close on time. It's about 11:55. I think we probably have time for one more question. I also noticed that staff had put a link to the Patience White quilt from the museum's
thank you.
database in the chat. Please take a look at that. And I apologize for confusing a few of these details, but that is a beautiful example, as you say, of quilting for memory and commemoration. So let's see if we have any more questions here at the end. It doesn't.
I could mention
please.
also our sort of collecting priorities moving forward. And our collection underrepresents quilts made by communities of color and marginalized communities. We have, as I said, about 400 quilts in our collection. Only about 5% of those are made by quilters of color. And ideally, that percentage would reflect North Carolina's population, which would be, over 30% historically of our quilts made by people of color. And that's a historical inequity that has been perpetuated in our collecting and our society more broadly. And something that is really a priority moving forward to identify and build collections related to communities of color, marginalized communities, and also immigrant communities. North Carolina is the demographics of North Carolina have changed so much since 40 years ago even, and to be able to represent that in our collections is vitally important to fulfilling our mission, which is telling the stories of all North Carolinians. So that's definitely a priority moving forward. Also representing, for example, the LGBTQ community in quilting and in so many other ways. So that's what we're working on. If you have any suggestions or recommendations in that regard, please contact me. I would love to talk to you further.
Fabulous, thank you. Francesca, if we could share the contact slide at the end, that would be fantastic. We are really now down to, we're out of time. But I just wanted to really, extend a huge thank you, Diana, to you for sharing your time with us today. This is just it's a wonderful part of our history that I know is so important and so valuable to so many people today, and that we have so much more to learn about. And I feel like this is just the beginning of the conversation about quilts for us, at least at the library. And so please, everyone, I want to ask you to join me in thanking Diana for sharing her time and her expertise with us this morning, and to thank all of you who have joined us. We are so grateful that you chose to spend part of your day with us today, and I hope the rest of your day is happy, safe, and healthy. And please do complete our survey. Staff will share that in the chat now, and that will really help us. We take your feedback to heart, and to incorporate it going forward, to make programs that are relevant to everyone. Please be on the lookout for the email that I mentioned in the beginning. We will be sharing an email with you that will have the resources that we shared today, some more links, as well as a link to a video recording of today's presentation. The slide in front of you now has our contact information. Please feel free to contact me about North Carolina history and resources. If you need research help, we will connect you and do our best to help you. And Diana's contact information is there as well. And you can also find her through the staff listing on the North Carolina Museum of History's website. And so I thank you again, and thank you, Diana, very much. So grateful that you were with us today. And I am personally so excited to look at some of these resources that you shared with us, especially in the bibliography in that resource document, to do my own further exploration about quilts. So we look forward to seeing everyone again, and thank you.
Thanks for having me, and thank you everyone who attended.
Thank you.